Get a load of this guy. He writes on LinkedIn about how he stopped giving away his best stuff on podcasts. He calls it a no-fly zone. He says he doesn't see interviews anymore. He sees shows, presentations, and then he says he doesn't want to give a TED Talk for 12 people. That line right there. A TED Talk for 12 people. My name is Freddie Cruz. Welcome to Your Mic, a podcast about podcast growth and mindset. And today, I am going to say the quiet part out loud. TED Talk for 12 people. There's something about that line. Something about how it's not business strategy, it's not positioning, it's not even bad advice dressed up as good advice. It's resentment. It's the reveal, if you will. It's the moment a guy who says he learned a lesson stops being the student and starts being the guy who resents the room he's in. And I get it. I do. I've been on stages. I've been in rooms where the audience was smaller than I thought it would be, or I've been in rooms where I thought maybe, just maybe, I get a deal, a client. I literally drove across town to a bookstore signing and had nobody show up. An empty bookstore with empty seats with my kid watching it happen. 3 people showed up. That was humbling. It was brutal. But you know what I didn't do? I didn't go home and write a LinkedIn post about how I was too good for the room, how I was too good for the 3 people who actually took time and bought my book and took a picture and asked me to sign their book. Because here's the thing about that room of 12 that guy wrote about. 9 of them might be exactly who he was looking for. And if it's a room of 12 that you're speaking with, 9 of them, maybe 8, maybe 7, maybe 6, maybe all 12 of them are exactly the kind of people you are looking for. And the rest, maybe they'll tell 9. Maybe they'll tell 12 more people. That's how this works, and that's always how this works. I don't think winners count the room. Winners fill the room. It's kind of rich from somebody who did a book signing and nobody showed up until 3 people finally did, right? Well, you fill the room by being so generous, so unguarded, so unafraid to give the goods that nobody in that room ever forgets they were there. And that's what I mean by you filling the room. When I was on a podcast tour for They Canceled the DJ and Allow Me to Ruin Your Christmas, I knew the assignment before I ever sat down with any of the podcast hosts. I wasn't just selling books. I mean, sure, I wanted to sell books. I want to sell books. But it wasn't a monetization event. It wasn't my chance to protect the framework or protect my work or protect my reputation. It was a conversation with somebody else's audience. People who showed up curious, in good faith, ready to listen to a guy who wrote fiction about radio and revenge and chaos. I knew that. The host knew that. And the implicit contract was already signed. So I held nothing back. And when I say nothing, I mean nothing. I talked about the books. I talked about the characters. I talked about the behind-the-scenes stuff that nobody asks about. I gave them the process. I gave them the mess. I gave them real answers to real questions from hosts who actually did their homework. And you know what happened? A few people bought books because generosity is magnetic, because when you show up open-handed instead of guarded, people feel it and they respond accordingly. Alex Hormozy, who you definitely heard me talk about more than once on this podcast, he said it about as plainly as anybody ever has. If you're starting out, give away your stuff for free. The framework doesn't stop people from hiring you. The framework makes people want to. So back to the guy on LinkedIn. No fly zones. Cool story. I get it. You got to do what you got to do. If there are things you don't want to discuss, like personal stuff, legal stuff, whatever, you communicate that before the convo starts, like a grown-up. You send the host a quick note. Hey, this is hands off. Hey, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about this. You handle that. If you do a pre-chat, you handle it in the pre-chat. Done. Nobody's going to ask you to bleed on the floor. But that's really not what this is about. This is a guest deciding that the host's audience is not big enough to deserve his best. And that's a different thing entirely. And let's not pretend it isn't. Real quick, if this episode is hitting, go ahead and subscribe to Your Mic wherever you're listening right now. Share it with somebody who's either hosting a show or thinking about being a guest on one. Either way, this one is definitely for them. Freddie at SpekePodcasting.com. That is Freddie with a Y at SpekePodcasting.com. SPEKE Podcasting.com. Now, here's the one that gets me the most. You don't walk into somebody's house and grade it out loud. It doesn't matter if it's got imported Roman tile on the floors or carpet from a 2003 Home Depot clearance sale. The host opened the door, they prepped, they researched, they figured out the questions, they set up the recording, hit record, and said, let's go. For you, for their audience, and in most cases for free. I do know hosts who charge their guests, but that's another subject. And that deserves respect, commands respect, commands it. Not a backhanded comment about audience-sized, dressed up as business wisdom. God, LinkedIn bros can be so insufferable. Now, I've been on the other side of the mic more times than I can count. 25 plus years in radio, over 1,000 interviews. I've done them. I know what it costs a host to prepare. I know what it costs to reach out to a guest, get them booked, do the pre-call, do the research, do the edit, write the show notes, promote the episode, and pray the guest actually shares it. I know what it costs, okay? So when a guest sits down and starts mentally calculating whether the audience is big enough for his A game, I take it personally. On behalf of every host who ever gave a platform to somebody who hadn't earned it yet. On behalf of every small show that grew into a big one because a guest showed up with something real. Because here's the quiet part. Remember, I said we're going to say the quiet part out loud. You never know who's listening. I want to go back to when I was on the radio and we were all asked to start a podcast. And I had a podcast called Book This. Now, the first interview for that podcast was with a guy named Tyler Jones. I had learned of his book, Criterium, on a podcast called This Is Horror. This was years ago. I think it was 2020 or maybe even 2021. Anyways, I read the book, absolutely loved it. Oh, man. It was like a cursed bicycle. Really, really cool concept. And I reached out to the guy on back then it was Twitter, and asked him if he wanted to be on my podcast about books. And he said yes. And I was like, wow, there's no way it's really that easy. And it was. And here's the story. This guy, Tyler, he was taught by Chuck Palahniuk. And if you know me well, you know my favorite author in the whole wide world is Chuck Palahniuk, the guy who wrote Fight Club and The Invention of Sound and Choke. And I was like, whoa, this is great. So I did the interview with him. Super nice guy. In fact, I had him on, I think, once or twice more after I left radio. And so back to that first interview with Tyler, I had shared the link with him. And then we were trading messages on Twitter. And he said that Chuck had listened to it and he liked the interview. I did not know that it was Tyler's first podcast interview. And I was blown away because even for a brief 20 to 30 minute long time span, was inside the mind of my favorite author. So you never know who's listening. That audience of 12 might have one person in it who runs a company, who leads a team, who writes a check that changes your year. And let's face it, if somebody writes a check that changes your year, that changes your life. The host who's at 200 downloads today might just be at 200,000 in 3 years. And they're going to remember every single guest who showed up like it mattered, and every single one who didn't. Oh, yeah. So if you've got a podcast appearance coming up, whether you've got 3 listeners or 300,000, I'm begging you to show up. Give the goods. Be the guest the host tells stories about later. Be the reason somebody in the audience reaches out. Give the TED Talk for 12 people. Because those 12 people, they chose to be there. They picked your voice over everything else going on in their lives. They picked your voice with their time, and that is sacred. Because you don't get time back, do you? Anybody who can't see that, well, maybe the podcast circuit is not where they need to be. Hey, if you found this episode useful in any way, shape, or form, please consider sharing with the podcast colleague in your life. Really, really appreciate you listening.